What's up, everyone, and welcome back to the Biblical Hitman. It's me, Steven. I'm here with David Smith. Tonight, folks, we have a lot of information we're going to put on the table for you, so strap in tight, buckle up, and hang on. But folks, if it's your first time or you're returning, you want to support the show, it's free. Head on over to YouTube, hit that subscribe button, like the show, share it with your friends, drop a comment, whatever you want to say. I'm open to it. There's a lot of opinions that float around this community. But also, if you are on the video side, head on over to the audio. And you can check us out on Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify, wherever you can consume all your podcast content. And while you're there, be generous enough to leave a 5-star review if you like the show, and hit that follow button and hit that notification button. Folks, we do episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. But with all that said and behind us, David, welcome to the show, man.
Really happy to be here. Excited that you reached out. And yeah, like I said, I think my buddy Trevor is the one that kind of like put us on together, and I know he's been on the show and had only amazing things to say. So
yeah, Trevor's awesome, dude. I'm glad I got connected with him. I know I got connected with him. I saw him on a few of my other buddies' shows, so I was like, this guy's talking about the ghost in the machine. This sounds like interesting. Let me bring him on in here and hear what he's got to say. And we've hit it off. I've had him on multiple times, and I got his book. His book is pretty cool. It's pretty awesome, man. But for the folks that aren't familiar with who you are, what you do, just let the audience know a little bit about yourself and where they can support you the most.
yeah, so that's what, like I said, kind of buddies with Trevor. We run a podcast. We are just starting out together. But the name of that podcast is called Bad Press. You can kind of find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. And yeah, I kind of helped with his book a little bit, just in the editing, kind of the editing phase of that. And then he's got another book that's coming out about the Shroud of Turin. So we're working on that right now. But basically, just for our podcasts, I just bring some research to the table. I have a history degree, so I've always loved kind of doing deep dives into kind of some of the lesser focused on aspects of history.
You mean the most important things?
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's the stuff that you might learn, like I guess just the surface of in school, but then as soon as you start to dig into it, it's just kind of like it balloons on you, and you go down some crazy rabbit holes. So try to bring a little bit of that tonight. There's a lot of different kind of directions that this topic can go, but yeah, I mean, it's just kind of it's just a passion project of mine to kind of do this kind of research.
Right on, man. No, I do the same thing too. I work on little projects like their book reports now. And again, I hated doing schoolwork and book reports back in the day, but now that I am like a content creator, it's just something that I've gravitated to, something I've built a passion for. And I like doing it because I think there's a lot of truth to some of these rabbit holes we decide to go down. And so I got to ask you, Bad Press, who came up with the name? And what does it kind of mean?
I think, well, there was, we kind of went back and forth. So Trevor and I have had some difficulties with naming various projects that we've been involved with. So we tried to name it first, Nobody Knows. And that's actually a play on, I don't know if you know who a guy named Wavy Gravy is, but he was this big hippie in the 70s. He was like kind of part of the Merry Pranksters, but he ran a campaign called Nobody for President. And so he would kind of play around with this idea of like, nobody loves you, nobody wants what's best for you, nobody for president, like you should vote nobody for president. So anyways, I had always loved that. And then there was too many podcasts with that name. And so we went back and forth, had some other terrible names, and then Bad Press kind of came up. And I think it was like, we tend to focus on, some pretty dark topics, some pretty, like we've done kind of MKUltra stuff. We looked into like Jeffrey Epstein. And so it was kind of, looking into, if a topic makes it into our show, it's typically not.
AKA how the world is ran behind the curtain.
Yeah. So that's why, there's kind of and then there's kind of a play on it of like, there's no such thing as bad press. So
I like it. I like it, man. I like it. It fits. And it's a typewriter, which is even cooler. It's just like, it brings like like a nostalgic vibe to it. But so you sent me a bunch of information, a bunch of the research that we're going to get into tonight. Could you just kind of globalize what it is you want to dive down tonight?
Yeah, so I think w- so I'm a big like Cold War history is typically kind of where I focus in on, which obviously the Cold War is framed by World War II. But specifically kind of within the Cold War, I've always loved looking into kind of like the CIA. So kind of into that MKUltra, 50s, Alan Dulles kind of that vein of research. But there is a guy that, I mean, I hear people talk about him, but he's not as recognized as some of the bigger names and, kind of the MKUltra field of study. But his name's Andrija Puharich or Puharich.
Hmm.
Um, I'll probably use both. But um, Andrija Puharich he was a scientist, kind of a doctor. He was kind of almost like a philosopher, scientist person that, he studied medicine during World War II. And then he goes off and he started something in the early 50s called the Round Table Foundation. And the Round Table Foundation was dedicated to looking into ESP and extrasensory perception and psychics and kind of all of this. They were interested in channeling, just kind of all of these esoteric topics, which is in and of itself not, sometimes I'm not really super interested in a lot of that, like, kind of these standalone people. But then he gets hired by the CIA and gets hired by the Department of Defense to start investigating things like hallucinogens. Like he takes part in some of those like Project Artichoke, MKUltra experiments. And then later on, he pops up bringing Uri Geller to the United States. And Uri Geller is one of the guys that they studied at SRI, at the Stanford Research Institute, for like, psychokinesis and all these different ESP and
Yeah.
kind of.
Like, is it, you think they're just trying to learn how to program the mind? That makes
Yeah, I
sense.
think they were looking at he kind of had a theory that got him a lot of like national attention and got him a lot of funding, that there was like this electromagnetic field that existed kind of between humans, that like if you were a psychic you could kind of tap into this field. And so he was looking for like a biological basis for, kind of extrasensory perception and things like remote viewing. And so he was studying the mind, trying to like figure out the mystery of it. And he appears to have believed like wholeheartedly and, in a lot of these things. And so kind of the CIA, when they're also becoming interested in that, we're looking to like tap different people. And yeah, definitely looking to, I guess it was like deprogram and then reprogram, yeah, the mind. And I think yeah, there's some some interesting people in the CIA who get involved in that.
Yeah, there's so many other players too, man. There's, like what's his name? Sigmund Freud, Edward Bernays. These are guys that, are kind of like godfathers of propaganda. But I think propaganda is just a little, compartmentalized section of like MK Ultra. MK Ultra is something that really developed and evolutionized into something a lot bigger than I even think they intended it to be from the start. I think they started adding things to it. It's kind of like when you're making soup, you keep adding seasonings to it, and it just becomes like this just gigantic bowl of just everything,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Well, and that's what. So I mean, it starts to like when I'm kind of like looking at it. So you have this community of people. And so Andrija Puharich, he starts what's called the Round Table Foundation. And he starts getting funding from like these blue blood, like some of America's richest families. And so that's one of the things that like kind of struck me the most, is that all of these people are, like there's her name's Alice Astor Bovary. I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, but she's the daughter of John Jacob Astor the fourth, the guy who died in the Titanic and who had one of the largest, like was one of the wealthiest men in America. And he had actually So in addition to being like this huge kind of Wall Street tycoon, like real estate developer type person, had written a book in like the 1880s about space travelers who communicated telepathically, which is like for the 1880s, kind of like a Jules Verne, like very, cutting edge science fiction. And so there was her, there was a DuPont that was a part of the Round Table Foundation. So another like blue blood family. There was a Forbes, Ruth Forbes Young, was part of the Round Table, and her husband, Arthur Young, was the one who invented the first helicopter for Bell. There was a guy named Jack Hayes Hammond who invented the first torpedo for the Navy, who was part of the Round Table Foundation. And one of his mentors was Nikola Tesla, who was interested, like when you talk about like electromagnetic frequencies and kind of like this, some of this ESP stuff. Nikola Tesla is talking a lot, about frequencies and, kind of that. And so, anyways, it struck me that like there was this huge community of elite, wealthy people interested in this kind of thing. And it made me think a lot about like secret societies and how there was kind of this occult thread through a lot of these different, kind of elite groups. And I had done some like research into, some of these like gentlemen's clubs, and a lot of that kind of thing in the turn of the 20th century. And that is really interesting because that's when you see like, theosophy really blooms. You see people like Aleister Crowley and like Thelema. As you get into like the early 20th century, you get, the OTO, and you get some of these different kind of occult societies. But there's kind of these elite families, like they have this interest in ESP, but there's also this interest in the occult. And so that was where, like, kind of when I began looking at MKUltra and doing a little bit of digging into it, that's what struck me about it, is that there seems to be a connection between kind of like the occult and MKUltra, or belief in ESP, which kind of like my theory is that ESP is like our modern language for stuff that would have been considered like magic or sorcery, like back in the day.
Right.
Like channeling, this kind of like some of like being psychic, like divination, kind of like, these things that have existed for a while. It seems like we have kind of rebranded remote viewing, like we've kind of rebranded it into like this, new language. Whereas I think like that would have been considered, magic or sorcery, 500, 1,000.
Right. One thing that I always kind of tie in with a lot of these things is it seems like this was a part of the religion that was prior to the flood. Like in the antediluvian period, this is how a lot of the world was conducting their business, or this is how the culture was today. And I think that we're kind of in, since it was introduced in those early, like those 1800s and early 1900 period, to where now it's like become a normalized thing. People like the chakra, people like the new age movement. They like all of these ideas of this occult knowledge, right? Because there's a science behind it. And I think that plays a part with why, there's a lot of ziggurats back in the day. There was a lot of pyramids. There was a lot of things were done through a hierarchy system, if that makes any sense, just like how we have today. There's a chain of command with everything. Um, but that's why the mystery schools are so important to them, because they're trying to like keep this information to themselves, and they can have at it. Trust me, I don't care about the occult, whatever. I'm interested in the things that they do as far as talking to entities and all this stuff, because I have a viewpoint on what those things may be. I think they're these things that linger in the darkness. They're the demons. They're the fallen angel entities, whatever you want to call them. But it's something that's becoming injected and normalized in our society today, because I think there is a mystery Babylon on its way. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. And that's what, I mean, I think kind of what you're like, it seems like that there was kind of this ancient religion and that there was this ancient technology, that existed, that was using these different kinds of methods, that we don't totally understand as kind of lay people, like, but they're aligned on, seemingly these energy grids, of the earth. Like if you look at, I remember listening to someone and they were explaining how, some of these, like the foundations of these ancient structures, like they look like a circuit board, like they, with like the ziggurats and the pyramids and kind of like this different, and how that might have been part of like a technological infrastructure. And then, you know, nowadays there seems to have been, this massive acceleration in technology. And when you begin to look at kind of like how this acceleration has happened, you get the standard narrative of, kind of how one thing gets invented and it leads to a breakthrough. But then, there's this other side of it where it's like, well, there's, a large potential that some of this is being channeled, that like there's a force driving us down this path, and down this, down
Exactly.
this technological revolution. And this is kind of part of that story where it's like, I think it's like you see people actively trying to like communicate and reach out and like, kind of, you're seeing, I guess, some of like the veil between the worlds or whatever, like being lifted in some way.
Yeah, no, exactly, man, exactly. So I didn't mean to cut you off or segue or anything, but
Oh, no.
we can get back into where you left off. The secret societies and all that, and how there's an interest, with the occult. I mean, a very high interest.
Yeah, that's what I mean there. So um, it's like when you look at the CIA, okay, so the immediate precursor is the OSS. And before the OSS, there's a very like unorganized intelligence structure in the United States. So I think like over in Great Britain, you have either MI5 or MI6. I don't know if you have both, but that's kind of like they're a little bit more organized. But when you look at the people who are involved in these intelligence networks, like they come from very elite families. Like they come from very, it's not like some random person from Chicago, um, is like being picked up by an intelligence agency. It's like typically these, people who are doing intelligence work, are part of these secret societies. And so really like what it turns into is like the core of the CIA and like the core of the OSS are seemingly rooted in these secret societies that are interested in the occult. And then you also have Paperclip, where the CIA is bringing over Nazis. And I was listening to an episode of yours earlier today. Is it Tim Constantine? I think
Yeah,
that's,
yeah, Tim. Yeah,
yeah. And he has some amazing information, like some really cool, you know, very disturbing, but also fascinating research into the occultism of the Nazis. And so, you have this kind of like homegrown, kind of Anglo-American occultism where like definitely Crowley is there. Obviously, you get people like L. Ron Hubbard and like creates Scientology. You have Jack Parsons, who's interested in a lot of this. But then, you also have kind of this German and this Nazi interest in the occult. And then what do we do with Paperclip? We bring over these Nazi scientists who were engaging in, mind control experiments. And we tell them, okay, like, let's work together and let's, kind of figure out some of this problem. Um, and so that's where kind of like there were, when I would like begin looking into the CIA, I can't seem to get away from kind of like those occult undertones and that interest in the occult, not saying that it was necessarily like their primary motivation, but there are definitely like elements of the CIA that I think are very, tuned into that. And so I
yeah.
think you get these standard narratives of what they were doing with MKUltra, and then I think underneath that might be, more of this occult, trying to channel, trying to reach out, trying to like, be in communication with.
Yeah, I think they knew what they were doing. I think they had a direct communication with whatever sources that they were using to communicate with these entities or these beings from wherever they want to call it. It's basically like in this either Akashic area or it's in this astral realm. Whatever area it is, it's outside of this physical plane. And I think there's a lot of players involved in it. And I think, the Vril Society, the Thule Society, obviously the Nazis, so on and so forth, bringing them over here, I think Americans were already involved in kind of trying to figure out how to, you know, brainwash or how to control the population involuntarily. But when they brought them over, they're like, "Oh, dude, check out these guys. Look what these guys are into. Let's incorporate it into our agenda." Because I think there's still this same spirit that's involved in all the nations that wants to do the same thing. Or it could be different principalities, but they're all playing for the same team of darkness, if that makes any sense. And these principalities kind of rule over these nations. If we're able to detach from the traditional view of how we look at nations and who's ruling them today, let's just forget about who's in office and understand that it's a spirit behind the whole entire thing. And I think it will like answer a lot more questions for people. But I think too with the involvement of MKUltra and in getting the occult and and using it as a tool to expand the program, I think it's only moving closer towards technology to being that next thing that will also accelerate and expand their agenda as
Mhm.
well. It's like they're making connection with these entities, and the entities are helping either program people or whatever, right? Because there's a thing called oppression, and even that, because humans can be easily manipulated with their emotions, and that to me that's just like a piece of oppression, if that makes any sense. But I think they're trying to really develop technology to put it in the body at some point to try and alter or take the agency of our consciousness, like a light switch.
Yeah. No, I
I know that was
definitely.
a lot. It's just I've spoken with Trevor a little bit about it, and he's a science guy, so he's like, scientifically, how does this make sense? And we got into like microtubules and stuff, and if there is a piece of technology that's able to, for an example, uh, you know, uh, you know, initiate some sort of anesthesia, then our consciousness has been removed. If that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that's like exactly, and kind of like what you're like looking at it kind of from an MK Ultra perspective. It's like if they are like kind of disembodied spirits and it's like they're looking for access to the physical realm, and there's like, I guess it's like when someone would describe the process of depatterning someone. So in MK Ultra, like they would go and they would try and shatter your personality. It's almost like they're trying to create this blank slate and invite possession into, because like the consciousness has been broken down. And so like that was a way that they were looking at it, through kind of MK Ultra and through Project Artichoke, is how do we create kind of this tabula rasa inside of a person, and then once like, maybe invite possession and then let that, kind of take control of the consciousness that way.
Yeah.
And that was a little, perhaps maybe a little trickier than, like maybe that was the theory. And then in practicality, that might not have like worked because the consciousness doesn't completely go away. Like there's still kind of a driver
Hmm.
in the car with no brakes. So then it's like, okay, with this like technological, like, yeah, I mean, how do you create that switch? How do you create the switch to like turn it off? Um, and that's what just like with the whole thing with like transhumanism, I think Trevor and I are pretty aligned in that. Is like that seems to be the end goal. And it goes back to, kind of like that's the original, part of the seed war and like the corruption, of the genetics and, fundamentally manipulating and fundamentally altering human genetics, to take it away from the creation, from the original creation. I think that's all. I think you can definitely see that as part of the agenda, and like why some of this technological revolution, seems to have happened in the way that it has. And that kind of spins off into some super fascinating, with what's happening, with different, tech companies and different stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, like
Yeah.
with,
Ethics is thrown out the window, by the way. Like,
yeah,
like they're a lot of scientists, which I think are the occultists of our day today. I mean, don't get me wrong, Trevor. I'm not calling you an occultist, but I'm just saying. I'm saying that people back in the day who were scientists were also involved with some sort of occult practice, if it was either alchemy, or some sort of magic or something, which a lot of them have, are open to it, right? Or maybe they were a part of some sort of, um, mystic or esoteric brotherhood of some sort. I think it was, I forget who, was it the Rosicrucians? I think the Rosicrucians said something where they were the what was it? They were going mind blank on it. But it's basically that the saying that they had was telling us that scientists today are what occultists were in history, if that makes any sense. And I'm not generalizing that for everybody, but I'm saying it seems to be on the same page. That makes sense with some of
Mhm.
them.
Yeah. No, and that's what there's a super interesting series that this guy named Christopher Knowles does. And it's called um it's like Lucifer's Technology or something like that. And it talks about the history of like the transistor. Anyways,
Mm,
it's this fascinating deep dive into science since 1945, because I think that's like the same year that the transistor kind of like makes its way onto the scene, and it goes into kind of this links of technological revolution to like occultism. Like it looks at the corporations that are behind it. It looks at kind of this cult of ufology and how they kind of like tie into it as well. This whole idea of like kind of there being UFOs that are reverse engineered, and that the UFOs are gifts, and that like there's this and that the UFOs, and I'm not sure in that series if he draws it to like that the fallen angels are the ones dropping him, or the ones like giving the information, but that is kind of the theme of it throughout. And I think you know Jack Parsons is one of the best examples, where, and same thing with like some of these Nazi scientists too. But I mean, you see with like Jack Parsons, he's doing a Babylon working out in the desert. He's trying to channel Pan, he's trying to like access these things, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, he comes up with the formula for, solid state rocket fuel, and it solves, the problem that they were having. They had the physics worked out. They knew what to do, but they didn't have, the physical material, the physical fuel to launch the rocket. And then through, like what he describes as channeling Pan, it just comes to him in a moment of clarity or in a dream or something like that. And that stuff is all throughout, science, and it's all throughout biomedical engineering, and
mhm.
it's all throughout, these different fields. It's like we think that that they are individual geniuses, but so often you hear a story where it's like, this guy discovered this patent in a dream, or something like
Yes.
that. It's like it
Yeah, it's something
happens
wild.
all the time, and like,
There's spiritual connections with a lot of these things. Yeah, I think the dream state at some point you can receive messages. Maybe our brain is put into a certain state to where we're open. There's some doors are opened up for some dreams are bad, right? Some dreams could be from God. You know, to say something about what Jack Parsons, right? Doing rituals and I mean, rituals to the god Pan. Well, Pan was also a god that the Greeks, which was worshipped at Mount Hermon,
Mhm.
right? Which is interesting. This is where Enoch says that this is where the fallen angels descended, 200 of them, right? There were, I think there was 20 of them, ruled 10 each or something like that. And they made a pact, right? They made a pact to copulate with human women and to start this or to just add into the seed war. If that makes any sense,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, that whole, and there seems to have been kind of a resurgence in, the worship of Pan, and kind of like like kind of this neo-pagan, movement. So I think they kind of go, um, they kind of go hand in hand. And then just like getting back to like that story, like, that was do like going into like Genesis 6 and going into like the Book of Enoch and even like back into like Genesis 3 with like the seed war, what like it all started to kind of like make more sense to me when I started to look at things from that angle. Like when I started to like, okay, think about, governments, think about corporations, like think about, the major players kind of that rule, that rule the world. I was like, it just didn't make sense to me when I was younger and I was looking at it. I'm like, just pure greed doesn't seem to like answer the question. Just pure pursuit of money or power or like whatever it is. It didn't seem to like fit the motives, like the extent to which, they were going to exert, authority and control and stuff like that. And so when I began to view it from kind of like this spiritual dimension of like that this is, spiritual warfare and that this is extends like way back in history and that there's this, kind of control, like things started to make a lot more sense. So it's like Jack Parsons channeling Pan and it's like, him, he knows who Pan is. And like going back and like, doing a little bit of that research, like things started to clarify a lot for me, kind of in this journey. But yeah, the stuff with Genesis 6 and, the sons of God sleeping with like the daughters of man and creating like, kind of this, race of hybrids and, these bloodlines kind of being descended from that and these secret societies and the mysteries all kind of tying back to that. It was a critical piece of the puzzle, for me and kind of
Yeah,
like my worldview. Um,
it's a game changer, dude.
yeah, that's what it was like. It
Such a
was
game changer.
revolutionary.
Yeah, it
Uh,
makes me think, so in the because I think some of the pyramids, some of the ziggurats, were places that existed in the antediluvian time. When you look at a lot of these places, they seem to be like some of them are even unearthed, right? They're excavated and they're dug up. But what did the civilization just cover it up? I don't believe that. I think that with the flood came a lot of muddy water, came a lot of water, and it disrupted the crust of the earth, and a lot of this stuff got covered up purposely. But who's to say, who's not to say that some of these pyramids and ziggurats, not only were they used for rituals and for sacrifices and all this kind of stuff, but what if they were used as, because I'm going to try and tie in, what's the guy's name? Puharich, right? The electromagnetic wave guy that you mentioned earlier.
oh yeah,
Okay. Yeah.
Puharich,
So,
yeah.
yeah. Sorry, I'm like just super English. It's hard to pronounce anything outside
You're
of
good.
John or James or okay. But it makes me think, were they also generating frequencies, maybe electromagnetic frequencies to maybe control certain areas of the population, right? Or to manipulate them in certain ways, right? Because you have to think there was a slave race back then. And I think what's coming into the New World Order idea into the future and what these fallen angels and if the days of Noah are to come again in the times of Revelation, I think that there will be another idea of a slave race. And when we look at our communities today, we look at our world, I can only talk for, the United States because I'm not sure exactly what's going on around the world. But we've got 5G, emitters everywhere, right? We've got frequencies that are flying through the air and it's normalized. It's a part of our everyday lives. Who knows what the actual meaning of those things are or the actual purpose of it?
Hmm.
But if we start to mix technology with the human body, I can only think that those things are also set in place to amplify other pieces of technology, if that makes any sense. For some sort of sinister plan. And I hate to get real dark on the show, but I think this is like what may happen in the future or what they want to do, because these bloodlines, they believe they have the right to rule. They believe they have the right over all of us. They are the kings of the earth, right? Like Genesis 6, the Nephal, right? The giants. These were the ones that were the mighty heroes. They were the men of renown, and they were worshipped at one point in history. And so I think history is going to repeat itself or rhyme in some sort of way. to where we're going to see this again. It's going to be in a different, it'll look different, but the same,
Yeah.
different, but still same. If that
Yeah.
makes sense.
Yeah.
Just makes me think like with the guy you're talking about, because I read in your notes, Faraday bags and all this stuff, like electromagnetic frequencies really have an effect on biology, not only biology, but maybe how the brain works. We just
Well,
don't
that's
understand it yet.
well, that's what. So there's a super interesting podcast series that I listened to, and it was called Penny Royal. And he was not like a scientist or anything, but he was talking about this specific place in Kentucky. And the host of the podcast, his name is Nathan, but he was talking about this specific area in Kentucky that he lived called Somerset. And it was in this region of like extremely high strangeness, like UFO sightings all the time, kind of on the border of Appalachia, there's Bigfoot sightings, like, kind of in this super high area of, just weird stuff happening all the time. And what he talked about is that there's a huge quartz deposit underneath, like central Kentucky where he is. And when they do like satellite or radar imagery of the electromagnetic field, like that surrounds the earth, that in this particular window, it's here and in Sedona, Arizona are two of the places, which is another crazy. It's like a new age haven. Um, but they're called the Van Allen belts, and the electromagnetic waves dip down. Like there's something about the quartz that attracts this electromagnetic force down into it. And the body has an electromagnetic field, like our brains have an electromagnetic field. And so one of the theories of like why all of this weird stuff happens is there's this interaction between like the electromagnetic fields of the earth and our brain's electromagnetic field that creates kind of like this almost kind of like schizophrenic, brainwave pattern. And that's not to dismiss that like everyone that's seeing stuff out there is like, just it's a result of like electromagnetic radiation or whatever. I'm not trying to say that. I don't know, but it's just like this super interesting anecdote of like these frequencies and how our brain interacts with the environment around us and how everything is electric, everything is magnetic. And 100% what you're talking about with like frequencies, like we just recently, and like Trevor knows, so much more about this than I do. This is what he does, for a living. But, we just recently got the ability to kind of study the brain and like the electric frequencies of the brain. And, they respond to different states. And one of the things that I was actually looking into that's related to kind of Andrija Puharich is the kind of electric, I don't know if it's electromagnetic or if it's just electric, but the state of our brains that is induced by hallucinogens. And, they change the electric frequency and like goes into like a specific pattern that emits, something like 420 hertz or 436 hertz or something like that. I forget the exact number. But it's just like, there are these different, so that's just one example, but there's acoustic frequencies that you can play to someone and their brain responds to it in a different way. And so there are all of these different ways to manipulate that. And kind of like what each one does, like I have no idea, but to say that like to say that that would not be a goal of a government, to say that that would not be, a weapon that they would try to employ either against an enemy or their own people, might be the same thing. But that's, I mean, it's been recorded as, being happening. So.
Yeah, yeah. And I have a buddy who Brad Lale, and he the Awakened podcast. He comes on all the time. He talks about his perspective of, not only some of these areas geographically, but also he gets into the ley lines, he gets into the magnetic systems, he gets into how along especially the 33rd parallel is a hot spot there's a lot of things that are connected to the 33rd parallel. There's not only pyramids and ziggurats, located on, some of these places. There's, burial mounds. There's ancient cultures have also, placed their tribes, and their little, cities basically in these areas. And also he gets into where he thinks that a lot of the things that we see in the sky pertain to the ethereal realm, right? It pertains to plasma, pertains to things happen more often, and the majority of it happens at, towards nighttime and stuff like this, because it has something to do with the sun and how the light shines in these areas. He's way more specific on it than me, but it amplifies a lot of these sightings, or even like cryptid stuff as well, because I think that all of these things are connected. I think the UFOs, the cryptids, everything is all on the same platform. It's just different ways for these things to enter into our reality or manifest, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So, and it's all crazy, I mean, there's so much to it. The world, I think, is more supernatural than we give it credit for. And I think a lot of the things have been withheld from us for so long, because you got to think people today, they only learn pretty much from their cell phones or what they learn in school. And so if those things are kind of uh, taken over by certain authorities, or certain powers, and they're able to indoctrinate people over time and disconnect them from what the ancients knew, or even just what people 300, 400, maybe even 200 years ago had an understanding of. We'd figure these things out, but I think they want these things to collide and crash at some point in our future, so that the ignorant people will be, will be corralled in a certain area, if that makes sense. When all these things start popping off, and then everyone will be easily corralled into this area, come on this way down the line, and a lot of people are going to, take the bait. If that makes any sense.
Yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. And I think, kind of at the point of like sightings, and I went in like down this kind of hallucinogens rabbit hole. Um, and that's what eventually I want to do something a little bit more with that research. But the kind of like there was like this, it was another kind of one of those anecdotes, but it was this, like this shaman, and he, like, someone was interested. It was like, kind of this is an older story, I think, from kind of like the 1930s or 1940s, but either the Germans or the Soviets went, into like close to the Arctic Circle, like near kind of where, some of these shamans were, and they were asking them about UFOs, because like their navies had been seeing a lot of like lights in the sky and different kind of things like that. And he was like, oh yeah, I know all about those. And, he would take, a large dose of hallucinogens, and then like, even though they weren't taking the hallucinogens, it was like he could make, kind of like these UFOs appear. And he would be like, that's not even the important part. Like, the UFOs are just kind of like a symptom of like whatever this is. But like, he was accessing like the spiritual realm so that he could contact like his ancestors or something like that. And the UFOs were like, kind of popping up as a result. And so it started to like also reveal to me that like so much of this stuff is, and like I said, I'm not saying that it isn't there or like that it's not real, but so much of this is like psychic, like in our own minds. In our own minds is like that we have like, we are more connected to this kind of like ethereal realm than we really realize on kind of like a day-to-day basis. Or that there are ways that like, kind of like the veil, can be lifted. And that's what this, like with kind of like Andrija Puharich, and like with this whole like CIA research into hallucinogens, okay, so that's like they're running experiments with like LSD. But then if you look at the history of hallucinogens, it's like this is called like a shamanic technology. And like as far back into human history as we can go, we can kind of identify humans consuming hallucinogenic plants in order to make contact with ancestors, in order to access the spiritual realm. And it's like we put such a distinction and kind of like, at least most of us put a distinction in like our modern world of like, this is the real world and this is the spiritual world. And it's like in these ancient societies and in these ancient civilizations, like that distinction was not there. Like the world was, it was all one. And so, anyways, I just like found that as super interesting of like there's this lineage, that extends pretty much through all cultures and all times of, people taking hallucinogenic plants in order to communicate with this realm and communicate with kind of ancestors, communicate with gods, spirits, like what have you. And then, we continue like this is just the modern, the modern day version of it. And there's been this hallucinogenic renaissance that's like cropped up. And it's just like it seems to not even really acknowledge this history kind of like behind them, or if it does, it only does so in kind of like a, haphazard way. But that's one of the things, like the elements of Andrija Puharich. So he um wrote a book called The Sacred Mushroom in 1956. And so if people are aware of kind of the story of how magic mushrooms kind of enter back into like the Western consciousness, I think that R. Gordon Wasson published his life article in 1959. And he was down in Mexico with, she was like I think he was in Oaxaca, which would be kind of like the more indigenous region of Mexico. And there was a healer down there called Maria, like Maria Sabina. And she introduced R. Gordon Wasson to psilocybin and did some psilocybin rituals with him, and a couple of the people that were down there with him. And so he writes this life article, and that's when magic mushrooms were kind of like reintroduced to, Western society, at least American society. And then he proceeded to go all around the world and document these different kind of ancient cultures who would use hallucinogenic mushrooms, whether it was psilocybin or Amanita muscaria. But even before R. Gordon Wasson published that life article, Andrija Puharich was studying mushrooms down in Mexico for the CIA. So it was like they were aware of, what these like, and, I think it's very likely that they were looking at hallucinogens as a technology to access this realm and kind of communicate with, entities on the other side. And I think you see a lot of that too with like the DMT stuff that's come up recently is, everyone talks about like these DMT entities and like this DMT realm. And it's like, it seems
very
like that.
popular right now.
Yeah.
And I would say, a lot, Joe Rogan podcast, I think, is what made that popular. Millions and millions of people are listening to the biggest podcast in the world, and he's bringing people on who are professionals and people that have studied mushrooms for a long time, talking about psychedelics, talking about connecting to these entities in all these different ways. DMT being probably the strongest one that you can do. And, there's been people on his show as well who talk about it took them 18 months to recover from one DMT trip, and that there were doorways in their minds that were still left open for these things to keep coming in and out, which is like trippy, dude. And one thing that I keep my eye on too as well, is how they are promoting and normalizing. I'm not talking about the Joe Rogan podcast. I'm just talking about society in general. The states, right? Like states are promoting a lot of things like ketamine. They're promoting a lot of things like, mushrooms and even just, legalized marijuana nowadays. But these things are being introduced into the population to be normalized, right? They were decriminalized for a long time, but now certain states are passing these laws and it's circulating in their populations, and people are enjoying it. I mean, there's a lot of, things you could use some of that for, medicinally, but I think it just does something to our consciousness. It either like, does something to open up maybe some doorways, maybe, because here's the thing, a doorway could be an idea, Like an idea then can become a belief, and then that belief could be manifested. And that whole little concept right there is the ancient Tibetan Buddhist tulpa effect. This is how tulpas were actually manifesting entities in front of them in the seventh kind, right? To where they can actually touch and connect with these things. So who knows if that's kind of some an effect that we see in our society today with all this.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's one of those interesting, and I tend to look at hallucinogens kind of like a tool. And it can be a tool, like as with any tool, like a tool that can be used for good or it can be used for bad.
Sure.
Um, and that's where it's like kind of like because I was talking to, and I used to be super pro hallucinogen, because it was like when I was younger, I used hallucinogens. I had kind of what was like, to me, a genuine like spiritual experience, like while under the influence of hallucinogens. They helped me, when my father passed away. I remember I had a moment while I was on LSD that was like extremely like meaningful personally. And then I was reading all of this like pro hallucinogenic literature, and I was like 100% gung ho, like, kind of one of those people, the annoying guy that you meet in college who's trying to get you to like trip mushrooms with
The
them.
DMT guy in the parking lot. This
Yeah,
guy
that's
tried
like,
to sell me
I've got a
DMT.
little bit of acid if you
Listen,
want
listen, I've actually made it in college, so I've had some experience with a lot of this stuff as well.
to.
We actually had the bark come in, the bark, we cooked it down. It was crazy. I don't advocate for any of this, anyone listening to this show, but I have, we all have a history. But sorry, I had to throw that
No,
in
that's what, and that's what, like, that was kind of, what framed a lot of my experience. And then when, I started to see the other side of the coin, and I started to see how, like, that this is really not, I don't know what I'm doing with this. Like, I'm starting to have, like, some really negative experiences with it. And so I started to, like, kind of pull back. And I remember I was talking to, like, there was this guy, and he's just an online friend, one of those people that you're kind of in a chat room with. And he seemed like he kind of like had an answer for any question that you would ever ask him. And he was kind of the first one that started to like really put me onto like the Genesis 6 stuff and start to talk to me about like the spiritual warfare and like really kind of like open my eyes to, this different perspective. And he was, um, constantly talking about, kind of like the bloodlines and different stuff like that. And, he was pretty controversial in the space that we were in. I don't think that a lot of people really liked him, but, he was very impactful on me. And I remember because like whenever I would have a question, I'm like, okay, well, like what's going on, with hallucinogens? Like, okay, so why would, if they're a plant, like why would, kind of like why would God, put them on earth, if we weren't supposed to use them? Having that question. And he brought it back, kind of to the idea of like, okay, it's a tool, like it can be used for good or bad, but also remember that the seed war didn't just have to do with humans, it had to do with like all of God's creation. And so it's like, if they have the ability to genetically alter humans, why would they also not have the ability to like genetically alter some plants? And I was like, damn it,
Yeah.
like
I
that's,
mean, just to piggyback on that idea too, it's like, I'm not going to go and eat the radiator that's in my car. It's a part of, creation in some sort of way, right? It's part of the elements that are from the ground and all this kind of stuff, but it's not intended for me. If that makes any sense. I think that's just kind of like a way I've kind of wrapped my mind around it. Maybe it's ridiculous, but these things kind of they I mean what most of mushrooms or whatever grow out of cow manure, so I mean, I just don't know how that would be intended for us. Maybe it has something to do with the ecosystem that we just don't know yet. Maybe it has something to do with the other different kinds, right, that we live amongst, right? The animals and or agriculture purposes. Who knows exactly? But I don't know. I don't even know if I'm making sense right now, but
yeah, that's,
maybe.
well, that's what I mean. There's and then there's this it's in like Plaincourt, France, and it's a mural in I believe like a cathedral. It like believe in a church in France, and it's like dated to like the 14th or 15th century. But anyways, it depicts the mushroom as the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And I always thought that that was an interesting
Hmm.
like depiction or like kind of metaphor for like the mushroom of um whether or not it was a literal apple or whether or not it could have been something like the mushroom that like there seems to be like parallels that could be drawn from that. But there are really interesting like cases in the Catholic Church, for example, where it's like there seemed to have been kind of like this sect of Catholic monks that were like eating mushrooms and doing like things like that. And in the Greek mysteries, that's one that's they think like the Eucharist, and for like Demeter at the mysteries of Eleusis was kind of like potentially this um potentially a brew that resembles LSD of ergot, and Demeter is the goddess of wheat, who kind of ran the mysteries. And all throughout, histories and all throughout religions, there seemed to be the Soma in the Hindu. I think R. Gordon Wasson has some like relatively decent research that says that that was kind of hallucinogenic in nature. So anyways, it's just one of those things that when you look at like kind of world religions and look at, some of these different conversations that have been happening for thousands of years, hallucinogens is one that pops up, and then it also pops up in this MKUltra. And from MKUltra, like you have the counterculture. Um, People don't necessarily realize that the first people that were like major players in the counterculture movement of the 60s were taking their acid that was supplied by the CIA. So Ken Kesey is one guy who wrote One Who Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. He started the Merry Pranksters. Um, was super involved in that whole movement. He was part of, I believe, a Stanford Research Institute experiment where the CIA was, giving out acid to people who um, people were involved with it. Aldous Huxley was, I think, either mescaline or LSD was like the first thing that he tried, but that was also kind of like connected into the CIA. And then the Doors name their band after The Doors of Perception, which is the book that Aldous Huxley wrote. Um, and through that, like you see, there was Alfred Mellon Hitchcock was his name, and there Christopher Mellon is a guy you see in the UFO conversations these days. The Mellons have always been, this goes back to kind of that secret society elite network, kind of early intelligence core. There's always been a Mellon, in the intelligence community, but this guy Alfred Mellon Hitchcock invited Timothy Leary to his estate in New York after Timothy Leary got kicked out of Harvard. They run kind of this new age camp cult kind of thing in New York. And then after that, he heads over to San Francisco and he starts supplying the hippie mafia with LSD that had to have been kind of a CIA connection. And the hippie mafia is the one that is distributing their LSD to, it's like 60 or 70% of all of the LSD that was distributed on the West Coast in the 60s and 70s was from this one organization. Now, the hippie mafia goes down, they get, prosecuted and like they get torn apart. And Alfred Mellon Hitchcock just walks away scot-free and then gets involved with, a bunch of other like crazy schemes. But, it's just one of those things where it's kind of like this, like what you're kind of talking about a doorway is that, a lot of people think that like the LSD bit the CIA in the butt and that they then had to kind of like reverse track and, really crack down on the counterculture. But they continue like there could have been this ulterior motive of trying to like push these types of things into the culture and open doorways, like, people unwittingly taking them at a party. And then all of a sudden it's like you open a doorway that you don't know how to close or you don't know what's happening. It seems like a lot of that was kind of, it was at play.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm wondering if the medical system is just another area of this whole agenda, right? Because I think The CIA has been involved in it. I think there's other players involved in it. I think they have a big influence into shaping our culture and the young generations, especially. Um, because with the things going on, they're crazy, right? So we've got young kids, yeah, younger than 25 years old, doing things in America that are outrageous, things that you see in video games, right? Pertaining to violence and all this kind of stuff. A lot of these kids are medicated, like they're on medicine. It
Mm-hmm.
makes me just think of, the Bible, where in Revelation 20 it says that, the nations were deceived by their sorcery. So there's that word sorcery in the Greek is pharmacia. It goes all the way back to what maybe the nature of it is, right? In general, it's just something where and medications are being pushed left and right. ADHD medications, there's so many medications that kids are on nowadays where I'm wondering if it's doing something, opening up doorways, maybe manipulating the brain in some sort of way, which they don't even recognize it as a pathophysiological effect because we can't see it through that kind of science. We can't see it in that window because it has more spiritual implications and effects and outcomes than we give it credit for. Because everything, like in the medical system today, you talk about things being spiritual, maybe having a spiritual, outlook on certain adverse events or certain symptoms or whatever, you're looked at like crazy. You're like, no, this has to have a scientific like meaning behind it. It has to be objective. It has to be experimented and repeated. And I think I think that's where the Bible just has more wisdom than we think. Like I remember, I forget who I was telling it to, but um, the Bible actually speaks about science in very wild ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember, I forget exactly where it is. It might be in Job, but it was basically saying that the lightning was made for the rain. And so when I saw that, I was like, hold up. Like I'm being told something scientifically. I just felt it. So I went and I researched what lightning does to rain, and it actually neutrifies the rain. It actually makes the rain uh have a very high amount of nitrogen in it, which then becomes natural fertilizer for the rain to water the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, okay, that's probably a reason why lightning, right? We can describe how lightning works and how it starts and all this kind of stuff, but there still is like a purpose behind everything. And I think the Bible, clarifies on some of those things, right? Not everything, but some of the things. And the Pharmacia is one that I feel tells us, to be cautious of,
Mm-hmm.
and getting into the psychedelic, conversation and all this. The Bible also tells us to be sober, like all the time. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
man, is that because there's spiritual implications behind it? Is this because we're opening doorways to whatever drugs that we decide to put in our body that, maybe, chemically impair us, but we can't even recognize it? And the Bible's giving us wisdom, just
Mm-hmm.
like a pretty just easy, simple saying, hey, be sober. But it really, if we were talking to the writers, they'd be like, yeah, you need to be sober because the medication's going to do this. And then,
Yeah.
but yeah.
Well, that's what I mean, and not to go too too far into it, but like I've had addiction struggles, throughout my life with like substance abuse. And you don't necessarily think of it like, or at least I didn't think of it, when I was kind of going through that as a like spiritual struggle. But then when a book that like revolutionized my life was the like blue book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And, in that book, they describe it as, it is a spiritual, like this is a spiritual struggle that you are in, and that you have like a God-sized hole that you are trying to fill with alcohol, different substances, like whatever, kind of the addictive tendency may be, and that the only solution to your problem, is basically, you need to find God. and AA doesn't, they don't put any kind of like restrictions on, kind of what that God looks like. But like I said, it's one of those where that was a pivotal moment for me in being like, okay, it's not that I just have like a chemical dependence on this. It's not that like my brain is, maybe my brain is a little bit different than other people's, or like, that it's genetic or something like that. But like, this is a spiritual struggle that I am, that I am involved in. And, when you look at it through that perspective, and then you look back at kind of your addiction, you begin to see those experiences through that lens. And you're like, that's exactly what is going on. It's like there's this corrupting force that, has kind of like overtook me. And then there's this, you know, agent within me that is like, doesn't want to be doing that. You obviously, like, vast majority of addicts don't want to be an addict. Like, you're, trying to find a way out. You're trying to like do all of these things through self-will, and like you're just unable to like, accomplish it on your own. But there's that person that's like, there's that, like, God's creation, like, you're reaching out and trying to like, get out of it. And then, to accept God into your life is to like, okay, now you have a path forward. Like, now that you understand the scope of your problem, it's one of those things. And I think that with substances and like with all of these, different addictions, and it's not just substance abuse today. It's a, addiction to like your phone. It's addiction to sex. It's, all of these different things. It rewires your, brain chemistry in a way. Like, yeah, I mean, there's something, I do think that it is like spiritual warfare. And I think like that, to be sober, it's not just telling you don't make a fool out of yourself drinking, like, blah, 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 blah. I think it is saying that, that puts you in a state of mind. It puts you in a state of consciousness that allows, something else to take over, or allows you to be manipulated, allows you to like, make decisions that aren't, representative of,
Right.
kind of, so.
Well, I'll tell you this too. I think not only the decisions, but I think the thoughts, like the thoughts that you have when you're in these certain state, it could be completely opposite of what you even wanted to do in the first place when you got to like a party or something, or this or that. Like, for example, I had a guy on, Jerry Marzinski. He's a ex-retired, or he's a retired psychotherapist, and he's dealt with people trying to put them back together, people with schizophrenia and all kinds of mental illness. And he was a skeptic, but now he's a believer because he saw how, working with these individuals, that they were dealing with demons, like that these were demonic, not only oppression, but these were demonic ideas. And then he got into more of the he started to speculate, are our ideas even our own? Now, I
Mhm.
think we can have ideas. I think, like, when I say to you, hey, what color do you want this to be? You start thinking of ideas. But I also think, like, when those ideas pop into your mind of something, especially that you don't want to do, like, who put that there? Is that something that my brain naturally just flashed in front of my eyes, and now this is something that, my body wants to pursue or something? Or is this a force that is trying to drag me back into something that I've, cut that chain off, that chain, disconnected that bondage from what you used to be doing. For example, I used to struggle with, this is way back in the day before I even got into the fire service and all that kind of stuff. But, I struggled with addiction to marijuana. And I promise you, every time that I would stop and I would break free from this addiction, like you were saying earlier, it's a spiritual thing, really. At the end of the day, it is. I remember it was almost every time when I would stop and I would be good, doing good. Every time I would be driving and I would roll my windows down, there would be the smell of marijuana. Like someone either smoking over there or there. And I'm like, dude, something's trying to get me, to lure me back into this bondage, or this dog chasing his tail uh idea, just over and over and over again. Yeah, but I think that it is a spiritual battle. Just to pretty much capitalize on what you were saying.
Yeah, and then, I think it's like, kind of when you talk about, the agenda, if you recognize that, this pharmacia and that these substances are a tool of or a weapon of spiritual warfare, and then you begin to weaponize them and to target communities with them, I think that that begin to make more sense to me on why we have, some of this drug epidemic is like, it's not just because we've gone, I think, to a certain extent we have, you know, some cultural issues and, definitely some societal issues. But I also think that there is, these forces that are weaponizing, drugs and targeting, communities and using that as part of the agenda, to break people down and to, debase them, demoralize them, and kill them, eventually,
Hmm.
with like a lot of the stuff that you see. Because that's where, I mean, I started out in kind of like a normal, semi-normal historical like research background. And so the first thing that got me like super interested into history was actually the Civil War in Guatemala, which is really about kind of Chiquita Banana and them, kind of controlling the agriculture like down there. And there's this really big civil war, but so you start with that, and then, that's a crazy story. But then when you start to look at other Central American Cold War happenings, like you inevitably run into drug cartels. And then you see like studying the history of drug cartels and studying the history of CIA drug trafficking and their, kind of roles with the crack cocaine epidemic. Are you familiar with kind of how like crack cocaine like made its way into the United States?
No, no.
So there was
Was
it
it
was
was it Tom Cruise on an airplane flying it in?
no, maybe at one point Tom was doing something like that. But, so it's the
Or was it
Contra.
Johnny Depp? Johnny Depp was another one, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, so the Contras was there was a communist revolution in Nicaragua, and the communists were named the Sandinistas. And the Sandinistas took control of Nicaragua, I think, in the late 70s. And then the Contras were the counter-revolutionary force that was trying to take Nicaragua back. And so the United States was supporting the Contras by supplying them with weapons. And then Congress ended up passing a law being like, you can't do that anymore because the Contras ended up being pretty nasty. They were just kind of murdering all kinds of people indiscriminately. So Congress passes that law, and Ronald Reagan gets elected, and Ronald Reagan is like, well, we need to still find a way to fund the Contras. We really need them to succeed. And they get caught up in what was called are you familiar with the Iran-Contra affair?
No.
So the Iran-Contra affair it involved selling weapons to Iran illegally and then taking the proceeds from those weapons sales and funneling them to the Contras. So that was a big scandal that happened in the 80s. There was a guy called Oliver North that took the fall for that, but it was the CIA scheme. George H. Bush, the first Bush, was the director of the CIA when it happened.
Oh, wow.
And so it was a crazy scheme, and one of the reasons that we see so many problems in the Middle East is kind of related to some of this activity of funding some not so great people over there. Because this was at a time when Iraq was on the rise, Saddam Hussein was on the rise, and so we were really worried about Saddam Hussein getting too much power in the Middle East.
Right.
And so
This was
he
like
was in a
before Desert Storm. Yeah.
yeah, so this is like 1984 around there somewhere. Um but yeah, so we started funding Iran, kind of some militias in Iran. And then we handle Saddam Hussein, but what was left over was kind of this terrorist infrastructure that was, has kind of plagued us since then. But anyways, going back to the Contras, another scheme that they had to fund the Contras was to sell cocaine in the United States. And so the CIA knew about this, it's tough to say like whether or not they were directing it or, if it seems like they kind of were. But the CIA sends these two Nicaraguans into San Francisco and they can't sell the cocaine. They're not very good at selling the cocaine in San Francisco. So, anyways, they get in a car and they head down to LA to try and sell the cocaine down in LA. And who they meet is this guy named Freeway Ricky Ross. And so there's a rapper nowadays that people know as Rick Ross. That's not the original Rick Ross. The original Rick Ross, the guy who he gets his name from, is Freeway Ricky Ross, who was kind of this like entrepreneur type figure, kind of like, um, I don't know if he had been like I think he had been like dealing drugs before, but he had kind of figured out the way to cook cocaine into crack. And so he was like, yeah, I'll buy your cocaine and I'll buy more of it, if you have it. And so he started cooking the cocaine into crack and selling it in South Central Los Angeles. And then all of a sudden, just the crack epidemic in the 1980s United States just exploded. And it very quickly spread to like New York and to Chicago and to these other like major urban areas. But it was like the Contras that were funneling the cocaine into Los Angeles, and the Contras were being funded by the CIA. And this was like such a big deal that the director of the CIA in the early 90s actually went to a town hall in South Central Los Angeles and apologized to the community because like, it was one of the few times that the CIA like openly kind of admitted like, yeah, we really messed that
Oh,
up.
man.
But it was like, it's just, and you look at these other times, like there's, examples of the CIA selling heroin back during like the Vietnam War and like, funneling heroin from the Golden Triangle down in, close to Vietnam, back into the United States. And all of this different stuff. And it's just like, they use drugs as a weapon to cripple communities. And a lot of times it's Black communities, but it's, poor white communities. And now, everyone is struggling with, pretty much at every socioeconomic level, there's some level, higher levels of addiction than there used to be. And you're seeing
Yeah,
fentanyl, which is terrible, but
yeah, it's almost like the drug space is very similar to what they do with climate, right? It's always kind of like control, right? So maybe maybe they're trying to use the drugs to try and test and see if it's able to control certain populations, right? Because we see the same thing happening to like climate control and, geoengineering and many other different, we see it with the food industry, with the genetic, the GMOs. It seems like they're trying to, it's just, they're experimenting with
Mhm.
creation, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of like I said, you research that and it's just like, that's evil. Like, why are they doing that? Are they just doing it to like accomplish those aims? And then, like I said, you kind of link it back to the conversation we were having earlier of like, the pharmacia and like the weapon, like the spiritual weaponization of stuff like that.
Mhm.
I think they've been doing that for a long time.
I wonder if they're even told to do this from these entities or these beings, right? Because who knows what's really happening, what kind of, you know, uh necromancy might be going on behind closed doors. And this is just agendas that they're rolling out for these, evil doers or whatever. It's really crazy, man. I think it gets more dark than we could even predict it to be, if that makes any sense. I think
Hmm.
what we see on TV is such a front. It's theater. It's not what is actually going on. I get pretty conspiratorial when it comes to that because, like, I'm talking about like eyes wide shut kind of type stuff, where these politicians or whoever's in power, that there's people over them, right? Because I think at the end of the day, there's the black nobility, the 13 families that actually run this world. They root themselves all the way back to Nephilim. They root themselves back to the fallen angels. They look at their DNA completely different than ours. And the world is their chess game or their playing board or whatever it is. I think at the end of the day, they don't have full control like they want, but they're they're rolling out programs and tests to see what might work or what not. Like for example, artificial intelligence is one that I think they've had for years. I
Mhm.
think they've had artificial intelligence for 60 years at least. And now they introduced it into the public. They're seeing what it's doing. It's actually demoralizing everybody. People can't really discern what's true anymore. I mean, especially after the Charlie Kirk thing. I mean, how many conspiracy theories went off about that? But you know, I'm not saying there's not conspiracy theories behind it, but I'm saying look at how everyone has their own perspective of
Mhm.
what's happening and what is their truth. And when you demoralize a nation so much, that is the outcome that I saw after that event. And it was just too much for me. It was like I was just if anything, I was upset that everyone is has the ability to post out on social media all of their thoughts, and now there's little camps that are building around, right? There's little uh people are like, "Oh, did you see this? This guy shot him with the lifting his sleeve." And it's like, "Dude, hold on, bro. Slow down." Everyone's moving so fast
Yeah.
that and I think when society falls into the category to where they're not able to assess and analyze what's true, then things will get destabilized after that. And then after that destabilization, there's like a normalization after that. Like this was
Mhm.
talked about by Yuri Bezmenov, who's a ex KJB guy who talks about active measures and how to take over a nation. It seems like that might be going on. I don't know. I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting because, like, I think to your point, like, what you've seen is like before the internet and before social media and before all of these kind of alternative outlets arose, through like, people got their news from, really like the mainstream media, and you're able to kind of control a population by controlling the mainstream media and pushing out, kind of whatever narrative you want to see. And maybe there's a few dissenters to that here, but you're able to label them as kind of crazy. You're able to push them off to the side. Like the vast majority of people are going to go along with the official narrative. But then, kind of, when you see the rise of technology and you see other opinions kind of enter into the space, you start to see like more pushback against the mainstream media narrative or like, the picture that you're trying to present. And that becomes kind of a problem, but instead of like trying to lock down on that censorship, and try instead of just like stamp it out, what you do is you then just open it completely wide and you start flooding the space with nonsense. And you start like, doing that thing, exactly what you were talking about, is like every single person has their own version of reality of what happened, and there's no consensus anywhere. And so it doesn't matter like if a couple people find, quote unquote, the truth of what happened. It's like you have, you know kind of scattered the space so much. And like, the same thing with AI, kind of like what you're talking about with AI. I think you see that happening all the time, and I see that happening in like conspiracy space too, where it's like you flood people with so much like different perspective, so many different narratives, that it's like the official narrative of history, is not what happened. And then you have a million different alternative perspectives, and not all of those can be correct. And so it's like you have to try and navigate this space where it's like, I know that this isn't true, and I don't know which one of these is true, but it's like I have to kind of like piece together, I have to piece together through that, kind of what makes sense to me and kind of like what I
Right.
believe in, and, kind of all of this thing. But it's a tactic that, I definitely think that they use is like, oh, well, we can't keep a lid on the truth through one form of media anymore. There's no longer three TV channels. There's not, there's the internet, there's all these different places to access information. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to flood the space with, disinformation and make it impossible for people to discern, what's happening.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, exactly, man. Exactly. So I see in your notes here, and forgive me if we've already like covered some of it, but Project Artichoke.
yeah.
Okay. Take me down this road, man.
Okay. So Project Artichoke
Well,
is,
I hope we've covered whatever you've wanted to. I mean, it's a
yeah,
lot, but there's more shows we can do together. I'm having a great time, dude. I think you're great, man. I think
I appreciate that.
you're very good. And then you know, I say that to everyone. No, I'm just kidding. I don't say that to everybody. But no, I'm having a good time. This is a good time. So, yeah, wherever you want
Yeah,
to
dude,
go with this is something I have a lot of interest in.
yeah, no, I'm having a blast, and like I said, I really appreciate you having me on. I'm new to kind of the podcasting space, so I don't know what always works and what doesn't.
Yeah, I
But
got to get you and Trevor on together.
yeah,
Yeah, we're gonna
we'll
work.
have to do
There's a
that.
great future ahead of us. Trust me,
Yeah,
this is gonna be a lot of fun.
no, that's awesome. Um, Project Artichoke. So everyone knows about MKUltra, and I've referenced MKUltra like quite a few times in this episode. And MKUltra is something that is well enough known now that it's just kind of easier to refer to. But Project Artichoke is actually the CIA program that both precedes MKUltra and also runs parallel to MKUltra. And so to understand kind of why there are two different, like quote unquote, mind control programs, is to understand that the CIA is not a monolithic organization. So not everyone who started working in the CIA always believed in the same things. The CIA was created in 1947, so it's not like this long-standing institution in the early 1950s. It's very new. There's a lot of people jockeying for control. There's factions within it. And the factions kind of have to do with, just different political differences and stuff like that. But I want to say that the Project Artichoke is run by the Office of Security. And the Office of Security is much more kind of hardline, anti-communist, and much more conservative. Now, everyone in the CIA during this time is like very anti-communist, but there's levels to the anti-communism. Kind of levels to, how hard a line they take. So the Office of Security starts Project Artichoke, and they also start, Artichoke was adapted from a program that was called like Project Bluebird. And this was when the CIA was doing experiments with hallucinogens over in Germany. So they had a bunch of prisoners of war that were both German and Soviet. And they were using drugs, and they were looking for kind of a truth serum. So they were looking for a drug that could just make people talk and tell them what they wanted to. And that didn't really, allegedly, it didn't work out the way that they wanted. But then Project Artichoke was more of a formal expansion of Bluebird to look at the potential of hallucinogenic drugs for kind of mind control purposes. But they were also looking at hypnosis, and they were looking at kind of electromagnetic, electroshock therapy, and kind of some different things like that. So they believed that they could hypno program spies. So they believed that they could put people in a dissociative state, hypnotize them, and then build a personality onto this suggestive state. So you could kind of like remove the person's consciousness and then build this new kind of alter ego on top of them. And that you could give that alter ego directions, and that alter ego could kind of hijack the consciousness, and that the person in their waking state wouldn't even know that had happened.
It's like me,
And so,
myself, and Irene.
yeah. And so they
Jim Carrey.
yeah, they were experimenting with this in, all sorts of ways. Like they were,
Believe all the movies, folks. All
yeah,
of them.
seriously though, there are so many, like when like I said, I was listening to like Tim Constantine's show, and he was talking about Indiana Jones. I'm like, they always know something. Like they always have access to this one also kind of like it reminds me of Inception, like the idea of like planting an idea in someone's mind, and then the idea grows, or kind of some stuff like that. But they believe that they could hypno program these spies and like build an alter ego on top of it, and that gets into like So programming assassins is another thing that they wanted to do. And so they wanted to create kind of these super soldiers, and they wanted to be able, yeah, essentially to remove like your inhibitions to kill. They wanted to get rid of that. And they wanted to like basically kind of design this super soldier and through hypnotism. And they also believed that they could do it through like through drugs. And so Artichoke, there's a, let me pull up the notes for this one because this is
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
an amazing.
It almost makes me think like Manchurian candidates.
Yes, that's
Okay.
exactly. So that's where like the idea of kind of
Are you
Manchurian.
familiar with Austin Pickard?
I don't think so.
No? All right. So if you ever get the chance, just revisit some of the shows I've done with him. Austin Pickard, he is incredible. We do 3-hour shows when he comes on. I mean, the guy's like incredible. He gets into all these things. He talks on the Manchurian candidates. He's into like the murder stuff, right?
Yeah.
Um, with all the MKUltra effects in there as well. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's what's, yeah, I mean, it definitely gets into like they were trying to program Manchurian candidates. And the whole thing is like they say that they didn't, but then you're like, there's something, something extremely strange going on. So, I think the best example, the one that seems to have like come out the most is not that he was necessarily like a classic Manchurian candidate, but someone who looks like he was a part of one of these programs, whether it be Artichoke or MKUltra, was Charles Manson.
Uh-huh.
And, he gets caught up in a juvenile detention facility. He's got a broken home life. He's into like crime when he's young, but he starts meeting with like he's at a facility that I believe was running MKUltra / Artichoke experiments. And so they targeted prisons oftentimes to run these experiments. They were especially interested in getting people when they were younger because your personality is less developed. So they thought that they would have a better chance to program someone and to build something up before your, brain had fully developed, before your personality had fully developed, which is extremely dark and gets into a lot of kind of like the more sinister sides of, not that it isn't sinister to do to an adult, but to target children because they have less developed personalities and to, say that you can kind of build a personality on top, it gets into like, some of the more messed up things that
Yeah, it's like
happen.
unethical,
Yeah. Gets into, there's something called like Project Monarch, which we won't go super into, but that's about, a lot of people believe that's about, targeting children for these same kind of purposes. But Manson was in a juvenile facility that I think was a part of, and this was in Kentucky, either Kentucky. Yeah, it was Kentucky. But I think it was this facility was known for running these kinds of experiments. And then he seems to have kind of a handler that follows him all over the country and seems to be like bailing him out of jail. And, he gets on probation and he violates probation. Instead of going to jail for 10 years in California, he like gets let go and he goes to this clinic that has a CIA doctor in it. And not everyone really knows like what exactly he was being prescribed at this clinic, but he would take, his family over there and stuff like that. And so it seems like one of these experiments that may have gone wrong and that they just needed to cover up because they didn't want, not that he was necessarily programmed, but that they were messing around with LSD and all this kind of different ideology and stuff. And it backfired. Um, but there's all sorts of, Lee Harvey Oswald was in some curious places at curious times with curious people surrounding him. So it's like there's, kind of all of this, there's a lot of speculation and it's hard to like figure out exactly what's fact and what's not. But I think, I think that they were definitely, that was probably one of the main purposes of them pursuing programs like that.
Yeah, yeah. It makes me think of Jolly and West. Where and it's so weird too because I think some of these MK Ultra doctors are like the Scarecrow from Batman, where maybe it's what I'm saying is they're not exactly like Scarecrow from Batman, but they could be planted in certain times, certain places, right time, right place, right, where they have an interaction with maybe this subject that they've had eyes on with full potential to do something in society, and then they just kind of they I don't know, they plant an idea, they inceptionize them with an
Yeah.
idea, and then they actually may go through with it. I don't know. It's pretty conspiratorial, but it's what we do here.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's what, when you get into, I mean, they certainly believed that there was enough merit to spend a lot of time, working on these types of things. And they also believed that the Soviets had the same kind of, technology or the same kind of methods, to be able to accomplish some of those things. But this is one, there's this story that kind of, it's a ridiculous story, but it's from an alleged Project Artichoke operation. And so it's just something that kind of like explains kind of what they were doing in the early 50s and how insane some of this got. Um, there's a particular event of interest in 1951 was the Pont Saint-Espirit incident. In 1951, residents of this small town in France went completely mad. People became extremely ill and some experienced hallucinations. Here's a quote from a Mental Floss article. The town became gripped in pandemonium. A little girl screamed as she was chased by man-eating tigers. A woman sobbed about how her children had been ground into sausages. A large man fended off terrific beasts by smashing his furniture. A husband and wife ran around chasing each other with knives. Even the local animals had gone mad. A dog chewed on stones until its teeth chipped away. Ducks began marching like penguins. Everywhere, people ran wildly as they tried to avoid imaginary flames. One man, convinced that red snakes were devouring his brain, jumped out of a window. Another reportedly leapt from a window, broke both legs, stood up, and continued running. Outside, a local postal worker complained that he was shrinking. A person sprinted down the lane, claiming he was being chased by bandits with donkey ears. Near the Rhone River, a man, convinced that he was a circus tightrope walker, attempted to balance his way across the cables of a suspension bridge. Another tried to jump into the river, only to be saved by friends. I am dead, and my head is made of copper, and I have snakes in my stomach, and they are burning me, he yelled. So this is from Pont Saint-Espirit in 1951, and the standard explanation for this is that there was ergot poisoning in their bread supply, and so that it was like a particularly wet harvest, and that the wheat rotted, and that it got into the bread, and that they all consumed this bread on this one day, and the town collectively went mad. But another perspective from H.P. Albarelli's book called A Terrible Mistake, phenomenal book, recommend it to anyone. It is an absolute tome, though.
What's the book called?
A Terrible Mistake. And the author's name's H.P. Albarelli, and it's about Frank Olson, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But in his book, he says that CIA sources attributed the event in France. Now, I think the sources are unnamed, so got to take it with a grain of salt. But the CIA sources attributed the event in France to a joint operation between the CIA and the Special Ops Division of the Army. And so the story goes that a potent LSD tincture was prepared and deployed through aerosols, as well as placed in local food products. So, I mean, that story of the people jumping from a window, breaking both their legs and continuing to run, being chased by man-eating tigers and stuff like that, it seems and this is like a well-documented incident. This is something that you can look up. And like I said, the standard explanation is different from the CIA, attribution, but it kind of looks like they dosed an entire town with LSD and made everyone go insane.
Right, man. Ah, man. And I've done some research pretending to well, before I say this, I really think that they want to, I think a big plan for the New World Order is to build a hive mind system where you have this queen bee, right, that is able to send its pheromones out to the rest of the population to do what the queen wants it to do. Like we've seen governments and we've seen so many other, you know, kingdoms and empires of the world try to control the masses. The masses are just too big, right? And when we just like what we were getting into before with the Genesis 6 thing, the Nephilim, the bloodlines, right? The right to rule. I think they really want at some point to try and control the population with, with their, hand in the pot, like to where they have control to press buttons. And now they don't have to push propaganda out there. They don't have to do any of these things. If there was something that they were able to, or if there was something that the population was able to ask for through a problem reaction solution Hegelian dialectic, uh, very similar to how we as people honestly advocate to lessen our human rights each and every 4 years. What if there was something to where an event happened and the people wanted to accept or usher in some sort of new system where technology gets merged with the body. There's this idea of transhumanism to where its front is peace and security, or safe and effective. Like we've seen that before, right? We've heard that word before. But really the overall plan is to merge this piece of technology with people so that now they can flip a switch or turn it on when they want to, or send a frequency out to manipulate people in their consciousness. Cuz dude, that's crazy, the fact that a whole town, not a whole town, but a lot of people in the town were, you know, they were they were subjected to this kind of idea, and this is the effect it had. And it just makes me think why they are normalizing drugs in society. Okay, well, they're figuring that out a little bit, that not everyone is into it. But if there was something that the whole population was, wanting, was craving for, was asking for it, and the population gets it, now the population can be controlled. I don't know, because I've done some research with pieces of technology that might be able to, you know, unplug or take you out of the driver's seat of your consciousness. I've talked about it with Trevor, and it's something that makes me think of Revelation 16, Revelation 20, and other places in Revelation where, those that have the mark of the beast seek death, they can't find it. There's this idea that will consciousness be merged with something else? It gets pretty crazy, with all the theories. Um, but it seems like these programs, Artichoke being one of them, and also the event that you just described, is like they're going after our mind for a reason.
Hmm.
They're playing mad scientist, sure, but I also feel like there is an agenda that they're trying to accomplish. It's just they're not there yet. So they're just trying, doing little things at a time to figure out the big picture of it. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's what like you kind of see through the progression. So this is very early on, and so they're like, okay, what if we just gave it to everyone all at once at one time? And then they're like, you
Mm,
know, this produced a result, not really the desired result. I don't think that they really wanted everyone, to go completely, you know, I think like 7 people died from this incident, and it became like an international affair. And the French government started asking questions that the CIA didn't want to answer. So I don't think that they wanted it to be as, big of an event as it became. Um, so then they begin to narrow their focus a little bit and be like, okay, how can we kind of more target this, to an individual, or a smaller group, than an entire town. And what they do is they seed, like what you see with kind of the counterculture, in this time is they create this psychedelic movement, literally create it. I mean, like LSD comes from, you know, it was synthesized by a Swiss chemist in 1945, but when it makes its way to the United States, the CIA controls the supply of LSD. They're the one who distributes it, and they distribute it in the ways that they want to distribute it. So they create this kind of psychedelic counterculture movement, and then they also play on the people who oppose the counterculture movement, and they have this division. And so they keep the population, you have the drugged out hippies on one side who are anti-Vietnam, and they smell bad and they smoke weed, all of these, nasty habits or whatever. And then you have the more traditional conservative American, and they are pitted against each other. And like, you see that dynamic happen over and over again. So I think it's like, these tools, the same thing with, you know, we talked about, like, just because it happened the most recently is like, the Charlie Kirk assassination. You see these lines drawn in the sand, and you see this division, and you see this, like, kind of civil warfare, not, to the extent of like breaking out completely in civil warfare, but you see the lines be drawn, and you have, populations, at each other's throats over these different, kind of different issues. And I think that's, one element of it too, is that they use, um, it serves their purpose to divide and conquer, as they're trying to like figure these things out. They don't want a united population, kind of with a set of moral ethics that they can agree upon. They don't want, people respecting each other's differences. They want,
Yeah.
and that's because I think like that's a reflection of the way that they operate. And so, like I said, kind of that point about the CIA not being monolithic and there being factions, I see that as kind of like the principalities like are at war with each other. Like they may serve the same purpose, but they have civil wars with each other, and there's competition, and they all want to be vying to control, this aspect. Like, if the end times are like nearing, or, whatever it is, that doesn't even have to be the end times nearing, like it can just be day-to-day life, like they want control of what the other one has.
Yeah.
And so I almost see it as like kind of a projection of the way that they operate and the way that they rule, because it's not, everything is not hunky-dory, everything is
Yeah.
not smooth and peaceful among like the ruling elite,
Yeah. Like if the leader of the rebellion fell because of pride, then it makes me think that the rest of them also decided to fall because they had pride as well. And so I think there is competition for who wants to be, king of the hill, if that makes any sense. And I think
Oh
it
yeah.
plays into part with, some of the things maybe like if we're getting into the talk again where principalities are governing the nations, then in Matthew 24 says that the nations will rise against nation. And we can see that kind of today where these nations, we're all fighting to be number one, right? And we can see it with the race with AI. We can see it with the race going to the moon. We can see it with a bunch of other things right throughout history. But, we can see that there is a competition between those forces that, and who knows, maybe on their side, it might be a friendly competition because in the end, they all have like the same goal, but there's still a competition there. And what's interesting too is like when you get into like the whole antichrist conversation and all that, well, there's one that goes into the temple and says that he's God, and that he's the God of all. It's Babylon, right? It's like this idea of like, Marduk being the one who was the god of like the gods, right? When you look at all the ancient pantheons, there's like Zeus, and then there's the rest of the other gods kind of underneath him. And I compare Zeus with Satan, Zeus, Marduk. So yeah, they're all kind of like changed throughout cultures, right? They're just different uniforms throughout history, but
Hmm.
they're still the same player. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And I just feel that's kind of probably what's going on spiritually with all this. And they want us to fight against each other because they don't want us to fight against them.
Hmm.
And they want us to kind of, have commotion with one another. It weakens us naturally. It tires us out. And maybe out of the chaos, that's when they're able to come in and establish an order, out of that.
Yeah. No, I agree with that, in the sense of like you begin to accept, in times of chaos, you begin to accept order, even if it's not an order that you would normally, submit to. You wouldn't submit to kind of a surveillance state, but if you feel like your safety is threatened, then it's like you're way more likely to submit to. I think we saw some of that kind of with like the Patriot Act and different stuff like that. They capitalize on periods of chaos. They capitalize on periods of, instability in order to like institute order, because that's what people, when they feel unstable and when they feel threatened is when they're more likely to, to kind of submit to some of those things.
Yeah.
And, it's like kind of in the battle, it's like I think about it, it's they're working towards like the principality, they're working towards the same agenda. They just have, different methods that they want to accomplish it. So it's like they're able to work together. It's I kind of think about it sometimes with like the mafia. It's like sometimes the mafia families like work together if there's like a common goal, that they have. Doesn't mean that there still isn't rivalry. It doesn't mean that there still isn't, competition among them, but they are, they're like still able to like work together. And I think that's a lot of how that, kind of the principalities work on like the big issues, on stuff like, suppressing, global populations and, things like weaponizing drugs, or, keeping people suppressed like through all these terrible different things. Like I think they can come to an agreement on that, but then on who gets to like pull the lever is when they start to, they start to bicker and start to fight. And I ultimately think that's like, what their undoing is, and why they're never able to like really recognize this control that they, I think they're getting, closer. And I think they're, um, it seems like kind of the noose is tightening a little bit, but they're never quite able to get over the line because of that pride, because of that hubris, and because like they have these fatal flaws, that, isn't, doesn't allow them to recognize some of those ideals. But we'll, you never
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. It makes me think, well, there's a few things that interest me with this order that can probably come out of like this chaos, especially you're just talking about modern times, the most recent event, right? Charlie, all this stuff. I've heard before the Club of Rome. I've heard them talk about that they want a world dictator. At their end goal, right, is like they want a world dictator because they want a perfect world dictator. And the only thing in my lifetime to what I could see could actually fulfill a perfect dictator is either Antichrist, an alien that comes here and says that he made us, or artificial intelligence that has no bias, has no opinion. It's structured, and it doesn't have emotions. And what I hear, what I heard 2 years ago or a year ago, whenever Trump was running his campaign, uh, he was saying to a group of Christian voters that he's like, if you vote me in, you'll never have to vote again. You'll never have to vote again, Christians. I'm a Christian. That's when he was like doing this famous line that whatever people went around and this clip went viral. But it makes me think when he's saying we'll never vote again, is this why he's building Project Stargate, $500 billion, investment of structuring artificial intelligence in the entire United States? Is this why he just went over to the United Kingdom and actually went over and talked with Prince Charles within the same week that Charlie got killed? And in these discussions, they're talking about you know s- uh, they're talking about infrastructure of artificial intelligence. Why do we have Palantir coming into the equation? Why do we have all of these Palantir's like the security of it all, right? And it's also a program that will monitor and collect data from every single American from anywhere. We've got Wi-Fi that is able to, you know, read us as we're walking through our homes. There's businesses where facial recognition is something that is very simple to configure, or it's as simple as sending an update to cameras. Like, I don't know if you saw recently, but there was a concert not too long ago where they actually used the camera systems to throw everyone's face that it picked up onto the back screen of the entire concert. And so facial recognition is a real thing. Data, harvesting and mining is a real thing. Trump is also moving us to, through the Genius Act, that we're going to be our monetary system will be digital currency. It seems like something is coming, and it's wrapping around us and we don't even know it. It's just, when is that anaconda going to squeeze, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean those are great points. And I have the same, I have the same outlook on kind of, the current administration, and exactly the same kind of outlook with like Peter Thiel. Um and that's what, like I said, it I kind of, well, probably at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I do think that they represents a different faction. I don't necessarily think that, every single person that works, I guess on one side you could differentiate. You have like Palantir on one side, and if you wanted to make a distinction between Apple and Microsoft and Google on the other, it's like, they're all major tech companies and they're all vying to do the same thing. It's just which one, gets to be able to do it. And Peter Thiel and Palantir, kind of through Trump and through, this, has been able to exert more influence. But at the end of the day, they're trying to create a surveillance state. They're all trying to create facial recognition. They're all trying to create kind of a one world government or a new world order. They're all trying to create, kind of this infrastructure that you just laid out. It's just, okay, who's going to be, who gets to be the serious power players and all of that. Um, and yeah, I mean, that's what,
It's
I
like a
think.
Tower of Babel system
Yeah.
of some sort. It's allegorical towards it, but it's still going to be something like it. I went and visited the Georgia Guidestones in person, and it says the entire world would be united under one language. There'd be 500 million people that would be sustained as a population. I'm like, dude. And a lot of people will look at some of those 10 commandments on the Georgia Guidestones and think it's ethical and think it's good and think it's what's good for mankind. Why
Mhm.
have we seen so many people that are a part of the World Economic Forum talking about that we need the population to, over time lessen, over and over and over? It's something, there's a big plan, there's a big group. We're not a part of it. We can see the writing on the wall. It's just, and then what's crazy is I think it's just going to be fulfilled. Like, I think that's prophecy.
Yeah.
If that's, it's dark, it's sad, but
Well, that's what I mean. It's just one of those things that, I mean, like I said, you just look around and you look at, it feels insane, and when you're paying attention to all these things, and I know that people at different points in history have reflected on the times that they're in and think that, the prophecy is being fulfilled, and kind of whatnot. There's that whole trope of like, every 50 years someone says that the world is going to end. And sometimes I like,
Mhm.
bring that into, I have to bring that perspective into my life just to stay sane, sometimes. So to be like, because I'll get caught up in like,
I'm
why am
right
I
there
wake,
with you.
like, why am I waking up at 4 in the morning to go to this job that I don't really like to make money? If everything is just going to completely, feels like it's collapsing around me, like, if I get into that space, that it's like, it's, not a good place. So I have to kind of like pull back and kind of think, but like, just to think about, like I said, just the technological revolution that we've experienced over the last, 90 years, since the atomic bomb was dropped in 1945. And to be like, the internet didn't exist back then, like television didn't exist, all of these, now we're shooting lasers from satellites in space to knock down drones that are remotely controlled. It's like, that's bananas. Like when you start to think of like the rate of technological expansion and all of that stuff that we talked about with like, how technology is kind of a tool and like a part of this major agenda. It's like, and now you're talking about, okay, so this is AI, is what we see, And like what you said earlier is that they've had AI, or AI has been around. I think that maybe you said that. Maybe I'm pulling that from somewhere else, but like just that idea of, okay, this is what we're being exposed to right now, but what is the true capabilities of technology that, the military industrial complex holds? Like if this is just like what we can see through Chat GPT, and like we can put it in and we can create a deep fake video that looks exactly like, a famous politician who getting embroiled in some scandal or something like that. Like what is the how long have they had that technology? Like how long have they, what is real and what isn't? Like what has been, put on a screen in front of us and, could be like a deep fake, construction of AI, or like what does that technology look like, in the present? And like with these, chips and like Neuralink and stuff like that,
Yeah.
it seems like they're ready to roll out the platforms. They just don't have, they're waiting for that big event. They're waiting for a catastrophe. They're waiting for, some event to happen, to be able to kind
Yeah,
of,
something that's big enough to create a global martial law. Something to where all the nations roll out a military style campaign, and this is the new world out of the old. Are
well,
you
that's,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I just hear a lot of chatter about, kind of like an alien invasion. I hear a lot of like in the
Yeah.
ufology community, like the mothership is on the way, like
Well,
2027.
you said a few things that actually play in my mind and connect to what I've been studying recently, and it's called the Raelian cult. Are you familiar with the Raelians?
That name, I've definitely come across them. I can't place exactly what they are,
Well,
but
it's wild, bro, because you mentioned 1945, right? The what was it? The nuclear bomb, right, went off. This is when a guy, this not at this time, but in the 70s, 1973, a guy named Claude Vorilhon, he went and had a mind speak voice pop in his head, and it was basically a voice leading him to a dormant volcano in central France. And as he went into this dormant volcano, a bell-shaped UFO craft, descended from out of the sky, and this basically alien gray, started talking to him. But just before that, they also told him to bring a Bible with him. And so as he's getting this revelation from this entity, and this entity number one it's crazy because there's multiple things that play into this. They say that their name is called Yahweh. They say that they are the Elohim. It's like it's a title. And then they
Mhm.
also say that they're the scientists that engineered us. So, and they also told Claude that basically, you know, we are awaiting our return. We need the world to enter into a time of peace, which makes me think of like Donald Trump's golden age. uh, and and plus the whole world is trying to push towards peace, right? You see a lot of conflict going on with Israel, Palestine, and all this, which everything else wraps around that because we all have alliances with those two countries. uh, and so the entity is like, yeah, we need you to come into a time of peace before our return. And it also tells this guy that we want you to build a headquarters for us. We want a headquarters that's going to be set up for us. So when we do come here, there's a place where we can not only land, but a place where we can dwell out of. And so Claude being told this whole entire message, he goes, he leaves, and he's actually starting a religion out of it. Everything that these entities told him about the Bible was basically an inversion of Scripture, right?
Mhm.
Which is nothing out of the ordinary to hear from an entity, by the way.
Yeah.
These entities do nothing but discredit the Word of God and flip everything that they can to make God the bad guy and them the good guy, which is so funny because they did a reverse Gnostic view of themselves
Yeah.
to the viewer.
Yeah.
They called themselves Yahweh, when when that in my opinion, that entity is a worker of darkness, could be Satan himself, who knows exactly, right? Um and so anyways, the embassy that they want to be built is Claude was trying to do it in Israel, right? Where the Temple Mount is, like where the
Hmm.
third temple is supposed to be built.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of rejection from Israel from this, uh, probably a PR thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you had a guy coming up to you telling you all about this stuff, you'd be like, "Hey, we can't. Yeah, we'll consider it, but for the news, we will say no."
Yeah.
Right? But who knows? Um, and he started going around to all the nations trying to work this up. It hasn't gotten anywhere, but it makes me think, okay, if this idea is credible, right? That the Elohim are coming back, right? We've heard this kind of circulate around, just some Christian podcasters and just Christian people in general, that those days of Noah, the end days will be until like the days of Noah, right? These are like the words of Jesus himself. So when we're thinking of that, we're thinking that these entities, they have one strike left, and they're waiting to use it for the end, and they're waiting to use it for the ushering in of this antichrist, this Maitreya, right? I don't know if you've looked into Alice Bailey and her writings, and she's affiliated with the United Nations, Lucifer Trust Company, and all this kind of stuff. They believe that the Maitreya will be this Christ figure that comes here. But first, what happens before the Maitreya is the externalization of the hierarchy. And so the externalization of the hierarchy is basically like these either false prophets or false Christs that come before. It's like the Avengers that are here, and then Thanos comes. But I don't know. It gets all mixed up, and it's all speculation
Yeah.
with all this. But it's a fun conversation to have, because I wanted to get your thoughts, with the UFO aspect, and we can close with this segment. Uh, you know, what's your thoughts with all of this, with the Elohim returning, fallen angels, aliens, UFOs? Ready,
No, and
go.
it's like super fitting because it brings it right back around to Puharich for me, and so it kind of spun off in some of the different directions that he went, but the original thing that got him super committed to, like, he was already into ESP and stuff like that, but there was an event that drastically changed the trajectory of his life, and it changed the trajectory of quite a few people's lives, and it happened through channeling entities through a guy named Dr. Vinod. And so he was doing all this work with the Roundtable Foundation with psychics. He goes to one of the psychic, her name was Eileen Garrett. He goes to a party for her. I think it was like a birthday party or something. And he meets this Indian mystic there who holds his finger and is allegedly able to repeat his entire past back to him, with incredible detail for 45 minutes or something. And so Puharich says, "All right, come along with me. We got to get you back to the Roundtable Foundation. We got to study you." And as he's taking him back to, the Roundtable Foundation was in Maine. As he was taking him back to Maine, Dr. Vinod enters the house and falls into a trance. And in the trance, the Council of Nine is what it's called, starts to speak directly to Andrija Puharich and basically tells him the same sort of story that they tell Claude, that they tell the Raelians. And
Hmm.
what they say is that, I don't know if they initially say it, but he eventually kind of pieces it together, is that, we are the nine, we are the Council of Nine, and we represent the original Ennead of Egyptian civilization. And we are actually extraterrestrials, and we transcend space and time. And so, we have been, influencing human history this entire time. And we live in a spaceship that's the size of a city, but it's invisible. You can't see it. And our return is imminent, and that you need to work towards like bringing a world peace and, kind of
Oh
all of,
my goodness, bro.
yeah. And so he goes and he, like, this, he becomes obsessed with it, and like this is right before he goes to work for the CIA. And there are all of these intelligence officials like swirling around him and all this thing. And like I said, that he's in a room with a DuPont, an Astor, with I think eventually the guy who, invents the first torpedo, the guy who invents the first helicopter, with a Forbes. Like, these are the who's who of, elite American society. And he's in this room with them and he's channeling these entities. And some of them are like, oh, like that was interesting. Like, wonder what that was all about. But then a couple of them, like Puharich, is like, this is real. Like, this is literal. And this is what we need to, be working towards. Is like, this mission that's been laid out to us by the Nine. And so one of the guys like ends up going, he starts kind of this new age, I think it was like the Society for Noetics. I have it. I'm not going to try and find it in the notes now, but one of the people from the Round Table Foundation ends up becoming like a major player in the New Age movement that starts in the 1970s. And he's kind of connected in with that. Who was the astronaut that was doing like ESP experiments in space and then came in? I think his last name was Mitchell, maybe.
Oh, Edgar Mitchell or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's like Edgar Mitchell comes back and he has like, some of these beliefs, and like, so the Nine gets tied up into that. And then the Nine is also makes an appearance in Star Trek. And so
Oh, man.
Andrija Puharich, he goes and he starts this thing. So he has this whole thing with Uri Geller. And Uri Geller is this Israeli stage magician who's also like claiming to be psychic and claiming to be like kind of magical. And so Yuri takes him to SRI, has him studied, and people in the government are like, oh my gosh, like this guy seems to be legit. And then Puharich publishes this book called Yuri, and it's just insane. It's just like babble. And so it's like supposed to be this book that like presents ESP as like this super scientific thing and for people to like start taking it seriously. And he just makes a complete fool of himself. But after this, he starts like a camp for kids, and they're trying to like train kids in like ESP, and trying to get them to like remote view and all this kind of crazy stuff. But during that, when he has this like camp, he calls it Lab 9. He approaches Gene Roddenberry through this British race car driver called Sir John Whitmore and is like, I want you to write a new series about Star Trek that's based on the Council of Nine and based on the Ennead. And he ends up, like Roddenberry agrees to it. So I don't know the whole history of Star Trek, but I guess it was originally created in the 60s and then it kind of fell off, and like this was a reboot that he wanted him to do. So let me see if I can find.
Yeah. Find this. I want to hear more. It's crazy.
So he like basically Roddenberry writes the script, and then Andrija Puharich and the rest of the Lab 9 people are like, no, this is not what we wanted. And so Roddenberry gives it to one of his assistants, but then Roddenberry eventually like leans into it pretty heavy. But he makes it Star Trek The Next Generation, and he bases each one of the characters in Star Trek off of one of the original like Ennead entities. And so Jean-Luc Picard was Roddenberry's fantasy version of himself, but Picard was also like the father god, Osiris, Zeus, Odin, etc. And it's interesting because Jean-Luc, the first name, translates to John the Light, which is really interesting given like the Templars adore like John the Baptist. So there seems to be kind of something going on with that. Dr. Beverly Crusher is Isis. She's widowed, has a young son, and is the object of Picard's affections. Raw Horus is Commander William Riker, who kind of takes over the Captain Kirk role, with like he's kind of aggressive, kind of that commander. Hathor was Deanna Troi, so she was clairvoyant and the ship's counselor. Her name likens her to Diana, goddess of the hunt. Her last name was Troi.
Jeez.
Which was the city of Apollo, brother of Selene. So Apollo is the brother of Selene, who was the moon goddess. Horus the Child was Wesley Crusher, who's often the savior of the ship. Anubis is Lieutenant Worf, and his last name is literally a dog's bark, which is Anubis is the dog-headed god.
Mm-hmm.
Data is Toth, the android scribe. And then Ta, or Ptah,
Yeah.
is Geordie LaForge, likened to Hephaestus or Vulcan in the Greco-Roman pantheon.
That's why Elon Musk located his AI, uh, corporation and building located in Memphis, Tennessee, because of the god Ptah. Right, there's a connection with Memphis, Egypt, and all that.
Yeah.
Uh, oh no. So that they, like I said, and one thing I got from one of the prior interviews that I've had before you with Jeremy Slate is he's a Roman Empire expert. He talked about how the emperors of Rome always compared themselves and connected themselves with the gods.
Hmm.
And if history doesn't necessarily change, yet it rhymes, we need to start looking at our leaders in the same way. Like, which means they also believe, they're they're sons of these gods. If that makes any sense. They honestly look at themselves like they are the Nephilim,
Hmm.
right? Like the offspring of the fallen angels. That this is how they live. This is the perspective they wrap themselves around. Um, it's so funny because I brought up, you know, uh, the Temple Mount, Israel, and this may be like a third temple idea which I think the Antichrist is gonna, go inside the third temple and claim himself to be God. That's kind of what I subscribe to. I'm open to a lot more things, but it's what I subscribe to. And this was in 2020, December 2020. Um, a former Israeli space security chief, Hayam Eshed, claimed that a galactic federation was going to come to Earth and does exist and does work with the governments of the world. And so I was like, oh man, I don't know if you remember that by the New York Times coming out in 2020. I know there was a lot going on in those
Yeah.
years. I was on a front run ambulance running 15 calls a shift.
Mm.
Yeah, that was a terrible time, man. But well, dude, this has been a pretty good show, man. This was a good time. I had an excellent time. It was fun, meeting you, and I really hope we can do more shows together. I love doing research, so I love it when someone has a passion to do the same thing and bring it on the show for the audience to learn something new, man. But if there's do you have any last not last messages, but do you have a positive message you would like to share with the audience?
Um, Positive message. Life is still beautiful. People around you, you can still, even though a lot of my research focuses in on all this negative stuff, heavy stuff. I've come to find, a lot of beauty in, life and like the gift that is life. So just kind of like maintaining that, for me, prayer, always the gratitude and stuff like that, that's really, just taking, being appreciative for, the things in life that are worthwhile. Like I said, that whole thing of like, sometimes it can be waking up at 4 in the morning. It's tough, tough going through. I'm super, super busy. But yeah, that's what, just kind of like that message of, there still are so many beautiful things. And life is still such a gift. Um, but yeah, other than that, I don't have a lot. You can find kind of like I said, more conversations, and I know that Trevor's been on the show, so you can listen to me and Trevor talk about a bunch of different stuff on Bad Press. We also had a coloring book about conspiracy theories come
That's
out.
awesome.
It's called the ABCs of Conspiracies. So
I'm
you can
gonna
look up.
buy it. My kid's
Yeah,
gonna color in it. We're gonna
yeah.
take it to the restaurants actually, and we're gonna color it at the restaurants.
That's what it's a great idea. You can sell it to you can hand it, you can tell the restaurants they can hand, these out as their coloring books.
That's awesome.
Yeah, just kind of a funny little side project we had. Um, and yeah, I would love to come back on the show, love to come back with Trevor. If you ever want to come on Bad Press, we'd love to have you on too. So,
Yeah,
uh,
that'd be fun, man. But
Yeah.
hey, well, where can they find your outlets, and where can the audience support you the most?
Yeah, that's what. So if you just want to listen to the show, like I said, Bad Press, available on Spotify. If you want to subscribe to our Substack, there's free subscription or paid subscription. We try and we have the podcast there, and we try and do different write-ups. So I love the written word, so I always try and kind of translate the research into that format. But that is called, so the name of our publishing company is called Hemispheric Press. So Hemispheric Presses Substack. You can kind of find it there, and you'll see, yeah, a lot of work from Trevor and I there, and hopefully we'll have some different contributors to that coming soon. We've got a guy who's really interested in King Arthur, and maybe like a true historical basis for King Arthur. And he does a lot of work with kind of ancient British history. He does actually a lot of work with Christianity, kind of um, you know, Christianity being present in Britain long before, the standard narrative says that it was. And so he's got a lot of interesting insights into that community. But anyways, there's stuff like that that'll be going up. So that's Hemispheric Press's Substack. And then buy Trevor's books. I know he promoted God's Eye View. He's got another one on the Shroud of Turin. Um, Really, really interesting stuff. So I've been able to read that a couple times because I'm editing it. But it's a fascinating story about the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, I actually got to dig into it a little bit. He sent me over the PDF, which was kind of cool. I got the first, little sneak peek.
Yeah.
No, it's cool, man. You guys have an awesome show, folks. Please go and support them where they need it. And if you feel kind in your heart to also support me, please feel free to do so. Head on over to the YouTube, hit that subscribe button, like the show, share it with your friends. YouTube links will be in the description below, and also links to Bad Press and everything else that they have going on for them will be down below as well. So, and also, folks, please support us on audio platforms: Spreaker, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Those are pretty much the three main ones, but we are on everything. I'm on everything. Anywhere you can consume all your podcast content, I'll be there. So everything, the biblical hitman. But David, this was an awesome time, and I had a great time. But Dave Smith, everybody.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, brother. Take care. Biblical Hitman Debrief. Let's go. I don't know. I was going to not do one, but then I was like, I can't do that. I can't do that to you folks. I can't do that to my guests. David Smith, appreciate you for coming on to the show, man. Holy smokes. We got into a bunch of different things, and I love how we made some connections there at the end, right? Pertaining to the UFO stuff, the alien stuff, the entities, the fallen angels, man. Something weird's going on. Something weird is going on. There's way too much activity. There's way too much movement to say that there isn't an agenda being set in place. When I woken up, or when I woke up to the spiritual realm, the fact of these principalities and all this kind of stuff, because I will say that I think the mainstream of traditional Christianity is not thinking about these ideas. Now, I think pastors are catching on because of podcasts like this and because viral clips and all this other stuff. I think people are catching on to the idea that we are not wrestling against flesh and blood, that we are wrestling against these principalities, these powers, this wickedness in high places. It's a part of our reality. And even though we can't see it, we can discern it. We can pick it up. Our spidey senses, our spiritual vision is picking these things up, and we need to be aware of it. And I think that I think we're getting into some times that may be really deceptive. There's just a lot of action going on, and I think we need to slow things down as well when that happens, because the world moves fast. You can't move fast with it. If a picture is moving fast in front of your face, you have to slow it down to really get a good clear image of it. So David Smith, thanks, man. We talked about um wow, so many things, right? Artichoke, right? We talked to MKUltra, the big players that seem to be involved in the whole entire operation. I like how he talked about it, that it's not a monolithic thing, right? MKUltra is not a monolithic thing. It changes with whoever's in control or whoever's in charge. And that's an interesting way to look at MKUltra. It kind of gets into different people's hands, or maybe some people take the information and go ahead and start their own programs with it, the idea. And overall, I think that Satan, right, Lucifer, the devil, I think he is a psychologist. I think that he, if anything, is the greatest psychologist of all time. I think he knows how else do you deceive people? How else are you able to change people's thought, perception, right, through propaganda? I mean, what did Eve go through before she was seduced and beguiled into eating the fruit? Something had to have taken place there. There had to have been some sort of conditioning process that happened before that event was done. I mean, it's you can't just have a few sentences with someone and then all of a sudden fall into their ideas. Something had to be set up. And it's how I see it. Now, I could be wrong. I'm not dogmatic on it, but it's just kind of like how I see it because I'm looking at the world in my own way and how it is in my reality, and I'm filtering things through the Bible. Got to filter everything through the Bible. The Bible is the truth. Bible is spirit. Bible is God. It's something that is here for us, right? So, and with MK Ultra, we were getting into the drugs, right? We were getting into a lot of these tools that are used to manipulate the mind and to help program the mind and to help color in the mind. I think that's why a lot of these drugs that we see are normalized in society. And a lot of it comes from the controllers. It comes from the people who are injecting these psychedelics or other kinds of altering consciousness drugs to the people. The CIA is behind a lot of this stuff, but I think that they're also doing this because they want to see how the people react to certain circumstances. They're data mining a lot of the outcome of how this affects the brain, how it affects the consciousness of people, how it affects the psyche, how it affects the decisions that we make, all of this kind of stuff. But David Smith, brother, I appreciate you for coming on the show, folks. They have a podcast called Bad Press, and him and Trevor Lohman are the ones that are a part of it. And I can't wait to host them in the future, both of those guys. I think it would be another great show. I enjoy working with them. This was my first time working with David, so it was nice to actually establish a little relationship with him for so far, and I'm excited to get them back on, together for the future. I think we could really collab on some awesome topics and have some interesting conversations. So, folks, I appreciate you. I love you. I thank you for tuning in. The audience is something that keeps this show going. I appreciate each and every one of you for getting through the ad space because, my goodness, are you folks supporting this show more than you even know by getting through the ad space? If it wasn't for you folks working your way through that, and I know it's tough, I know it's hard, I know it sucks, but you're keeping the show going. And I want you to keep that in mind, right? And I do want to start to work on something for y'all. Something small, something that I can do for as a giveaway, to show my appreciation and my love. The only thing I can really do right now financially is just telling you with my own, with my heart, right? And what dwells in my heart, right? The mouth professes. So I love you guys. I thank you so much for giving this show a chance and being a part of the community that we're building. I think it's something that, God's working on me too, folks. God's working on me each and every show. There's some comments that, you people sharpen me up. I tell you what, y'all call me out sometimes, and it's cool. I appreciate that. Sometimes I get hurt, though. Sometimes it makes me feel sad, but that's all part of the game here. This life is not a nice jog in the park, if that makes any sense. Especially for being a Christian, you're kind of like under the microscope a lot. So, but I'm here to receive constructive criticism in any way, shape, or form. I'm here to be receptive to it and to learn from it. I don't know everything, and so if there's something that I say or I do, or if I have someone on and maybe I don't, I'm not trying to Bible thump people on this show. I'm trying to network and to make friendships with people to show them the spirit that lives in me. I'm trying to show them God in some certain ways that I can. And sometimes I just don't feel like steamrolling people. And uh, you know, I think there's tactics behind that. And I think that's God is also giving me that kind of intuition to treat certain guests that come on that may not be believers in Jesus Christ, because it's time to make relationships. It's time to show people love and time to show them the fruits, and to show them ho what I'm doing with my living, rather than, you know, what I can tell them over and over and over again, and they just won't get. Now I'm God's working on me with Romans 1:16, not being ashamed, and I'm really trying to provide that for each and every episode whenever I can. If I tie in certain connections with certain topics with people that are not of the faith, I can try and share the gospel as quick and easy as possible. But it's not that easy. And but with all that said, folks, I'm not going to sit here and keep rambling on. I love you guys. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for supporting this show. You guys rock. Okay. And folks, please hit that subscribe button over on YouTube. It helps the show. It's free. Like the show, comment, all of the things. I want to hear your opinions, and I will try my best to get back to each and every comment. Also, you can find us on audio platforms as well: Apple Podcasts, Spreaker, and Spotify. While you're there, 5-star reviews only. Oh, so kindly. And follow. Hit that follow button. I've got you know a bunch of y'all over here on the YouTube side. It wouldn't hurt if you head on over to the audio, listen to an episode, and smash that follow button. And also drop comments as well. Folks, hit that notification bell on both sides, video and audio, because we post every Monday, Wednesday, and Saturday. 4 a.m. for audio, 8 p.m. video, and that's the schedule for right now until things change. I do apologize for not being in the live chat. Sometimes I am recording with guests, and I'm trying to keep more content flowing for you folks. So, but with all that said, thank you so much. God bless everybody. Love you. Gonna see you next time.